Hello, I am Emily Thomas, an Associate Professor of Philosophy at Durham University. I've written a lot on the history of philosophy, including on some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today, and I've even thought about how Descartes thinks about travel. But today, we are going to be asking whether we should be Cartesian dualists. How the mind relates to the body is one of the biggest and oldest questions in Western philosophy. Back in the medieval period, philosophers often thought about the mind-body relationship using some kind of matter-form theory. So, for example, they might say that in the same way that spoon is the form of this chunk of metal or this bit of plastic, mind is the form of the human body. Descartes came along in the 17th century and upended all of this. Descartes argues that mind and body are two separate substances. There is a real distinction between them, which means that they can exist independently of one another. For Descartes, the mind is a thinking thing which is not extended in length, breadth and depth. In contrast, the body is extended, but it is incapable of thought. In Descartes' 1641 Meditations, he puts forward a couple of different arguments for Cartesian dualism, and we're going to be looking at two of them. The first of these arguments is now known as Descartes' argument from conceivability. In the Meditations, he writes as follows: I have a clear and distinct idea of myself in as far as I am only a thinking and unextended thing, and I possess a distinct idea of my body in as far as it is only an extended and unthinking thing. So it is certain that I, that is my mind, is entirely and truly distinct from my body and may exist without it. So here's an argument that we can extract out of this. Premise 1. I can conceive myself existing without a body. Maybe you might do so by imagining your soul or your consciousness floating up out of your body. You might also do so by picturing yourself at the moment of death. You quite often see this in movies or TV shows, that someone has freshly died and they are now a spirit or a ghost standing over their own corpse. Second premise: if I can conceive that one thing can exist without another thing, then it is possible for that thing to exist without the other thing. If both these premises are true, then the conclusion follows that it is possible for me to exist without my body. And if that's the case, then it looks as though our minds and our bodies must be distinct, separate things. Cartesian dualism follows. There are a couple of different ways of resisting this argument. One way is to reject the first premise. Can you really conceive yourself existing without a body? You might think that when you're imagining yourself floating out of your body or newly departed at the moment of death, you're still really imagining yourself with a body. It's just a different one. And in fact, that's exactly what we see in ghost movies. The ghost usually has a body. It's a bit more see-through and a bit more incorporeal than the old one, but that's kind of how you see him standing over his corpse. He's got a body that we can imagine. You might also think that what it is to be a mind, to feel or to think, involves having a body. So for example, for me to feel happy involves me smiling, or maybe not smiling, but at the very least being in a particular brain state that feels like happiness. You might think it just doesn't make sense to talk about having a mind if we also lack a body. The other way to go to reject this argument is to reject its second premise. Why should we think that just because I can conceive two things separately means that they can really exist separately? This premise is relying on a principle that philosophers call conceivability implies possibility. Why should we accept this premise? Well, Descartes says that we should because he trusts in God. Descartes thinks that God wouldn't allow us to conceive something really clearly and for that thing not to be possible. But other people are more skeptical. On the one hand, it might seem that conceivability is a good guide to possibility. I can conceive lots of things that actually do seem to be possible. For example, I can conceive explorers discovering giant mushrooms in a forest somewhere. Seems like this is possible. Evolution could have produced enormous mushrooms. Similarly, I can conceive neon-spotted colourful dinosaurs. Again, this seems unlikely but possible that these sorts of creatures might have existed or could exist somewhere in the future. The counterexample to this claim that conceivability does imply possibility lies in things like this. So here is a star that you can see in the morning. It's known as the morning star. Here's another star that you can see at night. Let's call it an evening star. Conceivably, these are two different stars. However, we now know that the morning star and the evening star are actually the same star. In fact, they're not a star at all. They're the planet Venus. So here it looks as though it was conceivable that two things were separate, but they're not. And you might think that exactly the same thing is going on with Descartes' argument for dualism. We can conceive the mind existing separately to the body, but in fact something's just going wrong when we do so, because in reality the mind and the body are identical. This brings us on to the next argument that we're going to talk about today, Descartes' argument from divisibility. The Meditations writes, "When I think about my mind, or in other words, about myself insofar as I am just a thinking thing, I can't distinguish any parts. I understand myself to be a single unified thing, although my whole mind seems united to my whole body. I know that cutting off a foot, arm, or other limb would not take anything away from my mind." So again, we can make a two-premise argument out of this. First premise, minds are indivisible. I think this has some intuitive appeal. When I look inside my own head, I do feel like my consciousness is one unified thing, that I am thinking and feeling without parts. Premise 2. All extended things are divisible. For example, we can imagine taking a mountain and chopping it up, dividing it into rocks. We can further divide the rocks into crystals, perhaps teeny fragments of granite. Perhaps we can even divide those further, indefinitely so. If minds are indivisible, but all extended things are divisible, then that suggests that the mind is not an extended thing. And again, Cartesian dualism follows. Mind and body must be separate. Again, this argument can be attacked. So you can do so by going after the first premise. You might think, well, is the mind really indivisible? Descartes talks about cutting off our limbs, and he's right that that wouldn't divide the mind. But how about taking a chunk out of somebody's brain? that is almost certainly going to have an effect on their mind. It might affect their memory, their beliefs, their desires. That suggests that the mind is divisible after all. Further, think about psychology. We commonly talk about the subconscious mind, the conscious mind. Sometimes we illustrate this using examples of an iceberg. We say that the conscious mind is just the tiniest bit of our mind, and that the great structure of it is beneath the water. Again, if the mind has parts, then maybe the mind is divisible. It lacks unity in the way that Descartes says it has it. We can also attack the second premise. Is everything that is extended divisible? I waved away what would happen if we really began chopping up little fragments of rock. But actually, we can ask, what really does happen? When we divide a piece of rock further and further down, what happens? Do we eventually reach extended atoms that can't be divided any further? Or maybe space-time strings that are also indivisible? As far as I'm aware, our best physics doesn't yet have the answer to that question. But if it is possible that extended things are indivisible, then again Descartes has not succeeded in showing us that the mind and the body are two different things. Is Descartes' dualism convincing? Well, historically, yes, lots and lots of people were convinced by Descartes' dualism, but not everybody. For example, his friend and long-term correspondent, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, raises big worries for Cartesian dualism, and in its place, depending on how you read her, she either thinks that we have to rework it entirely, or she thinks that we should do away with dualism altogether. Another 17th century philosopher, Anne Conway, argues that there aren't two different kinds of created substances. There's just one kind, and it can be more like mind or more like body, depending on the properties that it has at any particular time. George Berkeley thought that there are no material substances, only mental thinking ones. In contrast, 18th century philosopher Joseph Priestley thought that there are only material substances, there are not any immaterial ones. Material substances do think, but they are strictly material. Today, people are still divided. There are a few Cartesian dualists hanging around, but not very many. In my view, what Descartes did that's so important wasn't that he came up with a new theory of the mind that everybody agreed with. It was rather he came up with a new theory of the mind that changed the way people thought about it. And in the process of disagreeing with his dualism and rejecting it, they came up with productive and creative ways about thinking of the mind-body relationship for themselves. And that, I think, is why Cartesian dualism matters so much, even today. Thank you.